resentful slave cope rules that are designed to keep you down and squash all your desires down inside you by calling it sin. So you waste your whole life suppressing your own childly instincts all to...
PhilosophyTube's recent video is provocatively titled, "Was Nietzsche Woke?" To summarize it briefly, Abigail Thorn argues that you can find plenty that is both woke and not woke in the writing of Friedrich Nietzsche. The answer revealed at the end of the episode, however, is who cares? A conclusion that I couldn't agree with more. End of episode. Of course, I'm kidding. Everybody on YouTube has to play the clickbait game. I certainly have to, and I can't blame PhilosophyTube for titling their video in that way to get more clicks. But the real question is whether there's any actual content in the video, any arguments or interpretations of Nietzsche's work worth considering. Unfortunately, most of the video doesn't focus on Nietzsche. It focuses on people that Nietzsche influenced. The initial minutes of the video are dedicated to listing off thinkers who either interpreted his work as left-wing or right-wing. Nietzsche was influential on the postmodernists, as well as on the psychoanalysts, but he also influenced fascists like Hitler and Mussolini. This is the lens through which Abigail Thorn approaches this issue. What did other people say about Nietzsche after the fact? And this is also true when it comes to the sources that inform the video. The bibliography almost entirely focuses on secondary sources, with only a handful of quotes from Nietzsche's books, mostly taken out of context. The only serious examination of Nietzsche's ideas is an explanation of the master and slave morality as described in the Genealogy of Morals. Now, I will say that PhilosophyTube gives a better explanation than School of Life does when it comes to explaining this concept, so credit where it's due. But as far as genuine engagement with the text, that's about all we get in this video. The rest of the video consists of tortured arguments for why Nietzsche's writings against anti-Semitism weren't actually against anti-Semitism, or spurious claims such as that priests are code for Jews in Nietzsche's work, or a lengthy discussion of Nietzsche's sister and her husband and their anti-Semitic colony in Paraguay, all of which is irrelevant to evaluating the ideas of Nietzsche.
An almond croissant. It's carbs and it's sugar. Fantastic. I desire this. I want this. But I really, really wish that I didn't. I actually have some problems with disordered eating. I have for years. I value carbs and sugar extremely negatively, and I avoid them as a rule, as a strict rule of how I live my life. But that doesn't...
Ultimately, I realized over the course of watching this video that I'm not even certain what the purpose of PhilosophyTube is. What am I supposed to get out of this? Occasionally, Abigail would seem to make a meaningful claim, but it's unclear if there's a broader point to the video overall. Was Nietzsche woke is a relatively meaningless question. It evaluates him retrospectively in regard to modern ideologies that he had no awareness of and no relationship to. As Nietzsche would have put it, this kind of question lacks a historical sense. The history of race relations in America that led to the creation of the term woke does not resemble the racial issues in Germany, Switzerland, or any of the other countries that Nietzsche lived. The main racial issue in Germany at the time was anti-Semitism. This was a real political movement during Nietzsche's time. There were multiple political parties based on the ideology of anti-Semitism. People openly identified as anti-Semites, and their political platform was exclusionary towards the Jews in Germany. They openly called for their deportation. Now, it's well known that Nietzsche was vehemently opposed to the anti-Semites, and I will argue in a bit with sources why Abigail's interpretation of Nietzsche's position on this is simply wrong. But does this make Nietzsche woke? Since we are trying to approach this issue with a historical sense, on this podcast anyway, no, I don't think we need to abstract the idea of woke from the modern day and apply it in an inappropriate context. But one could say that in the context of the main racial issue of his day, Nietzsche was on the side of the racial minorities. Now, there are some complications to this, which we will discuss. But the important thing is that Abigail acknowledges these facts, that Nietzsche was opposed to anti-Semitism, but then tries to claim that Nietzsche disliked the anti-Semites for other reasons, and that actually he hated the Jews. This is manifestly untrue, as we will see when we get into the sources. But before we respond to these claims, there was something I noticed on repeated viewings of the video. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the video is what isn't in it. While Abigail is expounding on the master and slave morality, in the background we can hear Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries.
They tell themselves, it's not nature that put the masters on top. No, they aren't naturally better than us. They're on.
And when I noticed this, the complete absence of any discussion of Wagner or his friendship with Nietzsche began to seem a little strange. Why wouldn't you bring up Nietzsche's friendship and eventual falling out with Richard Wagner, a famous composer and a famous anti-Semite? That would seem to be highly relevant to the topic at hand, wouldn't it? And surely Philosophy Tube is aware of Richard Wagner because they're using his music. But you could watch this entire video and come away without being aware that Nietzsche even knew Wagner. Why the omission? Well, possibly because Nietzsche's falling out with Wagner is problematic for the entire case being presented here. For all the time that Abigail spends talking about Nietzsche's alleged influence on Hitler, which is dubious, she spends no time on Wagner's writings, which certainly influenced Hitler. In the words of Walter Kaufmann, quote, Hitler, of course, knew 50 times as much about Wagner as he did about Nietzsche, and Wagner's essays, unlike Nietzsche's, did not have to be expurgated by the Nazis before being used in schools, end quote. So what is the story with Nietzsche and Wagner? Well, I've done a whole video on this, but here's the short version. Wagner spent 3 years in Switzerland at the same time that Nietzsche was teaching there, and Nietzsche frequently visited him during this time. This was the start of their friendship. They bonded over their mutual love of Schopenhauer's philosophy, and Wagner loved that Nietzsche loved Wagner's music. But then Wagner moved to Bayreuth, the center of his fan base in Europe, and Nietzsche began to see a side of Wagner that he greatly disliked. The Wagnerians, the word for his followers, tended to be Lutheran. They tended to be German nationalists, and they tended to be anti-Semites. It would be one thing if Nietzsche simply disliked Wagner's followers, but Nietzsche came to believe that Wagner was drunk on the adulation of this growing personality cult, and that he was steadily assenting to all of the prejudices of the common nationalistic Germans with their Völkisch sentiments. If you're wondering whether there is a direct explanation from Nietzsche about their falling out, well, there is. Nietzsche writes in Ecce Homo, quote, "What did I never forgive Wagner? That he became Reichsdeutsch," end quote. And in a passage that can be found in Nietzsche contra Wagner, quote, "I said farewell to Wagner in my heart. Since Wagner moved to Germany, he had condescended, step by step, to everything I despise, even to anti-Semitism," end quote. Nietzsche elaborates further in the case of Wagner, quote, "All Wagner's ideas straightway become manias. He is tyrannized over by them. How can such a man allow himself to be tyrannized over in this way, for instance by his hatred of Jews?" End quote. There are many other places in Nietzsche's work where he discusses this, but he's always consistent about it. If we are to take Nietzsche at his word, based on what he writes in his published works, the reasons he always gives are Wagner's German nationalism, his Christian romanticism, and his anti-Semitism. Now, in the interest of fairness, sometimes people do suggest that Nietzsche's break with Wagner was also personal. But this is speculation, and we can conclude at the very least that it would be odd if Nietzsche listed off a series of ideological disagreements, all of which he also opposes in the arguments he makes in his books, but then conclude that only the opposition to anti-Semitism was somehow less than genuine. No one questions Nietzsche's opposition to Christianity. Philosophy Tube brings it up in that same video. And that is one of the reasons that he gives for the break with Wagner. So why would he need to invent an additional reason of Wagner's anti-Semitism if he didn't really mean it? And on what basis could you make that claim that he didn't really mean it, when again, all of these ideologies, anti-Semitism, German nationalism, Christianity, Romanticism, are also criticized in Nietzsche's published work? Philosophy Tube, on the other hand, tries to present Nietzsche's problems with anti-Semitism as strictly personal. She argues that Nietzsche's hatred of the anti-Semites begins with a dispute with his publisher. Nietzsche's publisher was lax in printing and selling his books, while at the same time churning out hymnals and anti-Semitic tracts. Abigail's contention, therefore, is that Nietzsche's reason for disliking anti-Semitism was petty. He just didn't like his publisher, and therefore he didn't like anti-Semitism. It's difficult to buy that explanation just on the face of it, but she fails to mention a couple things. For one, this conflict with Nietzsche's publisher rose beyond the level of a mere dispute. Nietzsche sued his publisher, and he actually won the case, which proves that it wasn't so petty. The publisher was legally negligent in their contractual obligations, and Nietzsche was vindicated. The publisher was ordered to pay Nietzsche a sum of money in that lawsuit, and so it seems a bit strange that he would then spend years afterwards attacking his publisher over something that had already been settled. But more importantly, she also fails to mention that Nietzsche had already broken off his friendship with Wagner by the time this happened. Nietzsche's problem with the anti-Semites therefore predates any dispute with his publisher, because Nietzsche broke with Wagner before then and had complained of the small-mindedness, chauvinism, and anti-Semitism of his Wagnerian followers before that time. So the whole idea that Nietzsche just didn't like his publisher, and that's why he didn't like the anti-Semites, can't be true. The dates are all wrong, for one. Abigail then makes the claim that Nietzsche perhaps also didn't like the anti-Semites because his sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche, married an anti-Semite named Bernard Foster. That claim also seems a bit dubious to me. People don't automatically hate their brother-in-law. But she says that this was why Nietzsche didn't like anti-Semites, because Nietzsche didn't like Foster coming between him and Elizabeth. Once again, we only need to look to what Nietzsche actually wrote to refute this. When Elizabeth married Foster, Nietzsche told her in a letter, quote, "One of the greatest stupidities you have committed, for yourself and for me. Your association with an anti-Semitic chief expresses a foreignness to my whole way of life, which fills me ever again with ire or melancholy." End quote. The phrase, "a foreignness to my whole way of life," doesn't indicate that Nietzsche just didn't like this guy for getting between him and his sister. This phrase indicates that he finds this person particularly repulsive, because Foster is fundamentally at odds with Nietzsche's whole worldview. That doesn't suggest a petty personal dislike, and even if it was that, how do you make the argument that this somehow translates into a hatred of anti-Semites more broadly? What this letter actually suggests, if we look at it with clear eyes, is a pre-existing dislike of anti-Semites, yet again. Anger over the fact that she would choose to marry a leading anti-Semite in light of that pre-existing antipathy. But the entire premise of the argument advanced by PhilosophyTube is that, again, we just ignore what Nietzsche actually wrote. We should trust some secondary source to tell us what he really meant. Even the claim that Nietzsche didn't like Bernard getting between him and Elizabeth is somewhat bizarre. Nietzsche didn't spend all that much time with his family after departing from Basel. And he wrote in one of his letters, quote, "I don't like my mother, and it's painful for me to even hear my sister's voice," end quote. In another letter, Nietzsche wrote that Elizabeth, quote, "lacks any sense for fine and even for crude logical distinctions. Her thinking is void of even the least logical consistency, and she lacks any sense of objectivity," end quote. From what I can gather, it seems Nietzsche regarded Elizabeth as something of a busybody. One of the examples of this is, in one of the major incidents in Nietzsche's life, his falling out with Lou Salome, his sister sort of tried to pry into Nietzsche's affairs, much to his chagrin. It's strange, though, because in the PhilosophyTube video, she admits that Elizabeth tried to fabricate evidence that she and Friedrich were much closer than they really were. Not only did Hans Schlechte catch Elizabeth inserting fake letters and journals at the Nietzsche archive, she also fabricated stories about Nietzsche. She made up out of whole cloth that he once met the Emperor of Brazil, a story that was later shown to be impossible, another thing I've done a whole video about. She even suggested that he had incestuous desires for her. From all the evidence, it seems like Elizabeth was the one who had an unhealthy attachment to her brother, not the other way around. So the explanation that Nietzsche only disliked anti-Semites because one of them came between him and his sister, that's the kind of claim that Elizabeth would make, but it's simply not supported by any evidence. There's a book by Carol Death called Nietzsche's Women Beyond the Whip, and she explores Nietzsche's relationship with Elizabeth in that book, and she argues that women in Wilhelmine Germany were socially pressured to feel that they had to have the patronage of a prominent male figure. Once Elizabeth's spouse could no longer provide this, as he had committed suicide, she attempted to take shelter under the growing prominence of Nietzsche. She began to promote the idea that they were very close when Nietzsche had dementia, and then even more so after he was dead. Now, Elizabeth was an admirer of Hitler. She was effectively a proto-Nazi, but Abigail rightly says that Elizabeth's distortions of Nietzsche have been kind of exaggerated. She was primarily exaggerating his relationship to her, not really making whole cloth insertions of fake material into his work or anything. But she did selectively edit and present his notes in a certain order and a certain structure in The Will to Power, which is meant to portray a certain narrative. And that can be misleading. And it's indisputable that this is precisely what Elizabeth did. You know who else did that with Nietzsche? Philosophy Tube doesn't really discuss this when they talk about Nietzsche's alleged influence on the fascists, but his works were heavily edited and censored by the Nazis. They wanted to present him as a quintessential German philosopher, but they didn't publish his whole books. They cherry-picked quotes, they assembled collections of aphorisms, they arranged them in a manner that benefited their distortions or appropriations of his ideas. Stephen J. Vicchio writes, quote, "Under the Nazis, an expurgated edition of Der Antichrist, a few anthologies of Nietzsche's work, and some unconscionable books about him gained currency. Hitler probably never read any of Nietzsche's books, nor could any of them be used effectively in the expurgated form. In fact, very few writers have ever been as hard on nationalism, socialism, labor unions, Germans, or what Nietzsche called party men. Indeed, in Der Antichrist, Nietzsche says, 'Of necessity, the party man becomes a liar.'" End quote. So, regardless of the fact that Elizabeth's distortions of Nietzsche's philosophy may have been overemphasized by some authors in the past, it doesn't really matter because the Nazis distorted and misrepresented Nietzsche's works themselves. And as such, one of the main problems that I have with Philosophy Tube's argument is that she basically does the same thing that the Nazis did. She takes cherry-picked quotes from Nietzsche, she takes them out of context, and she arranges them in a certain way to promote an agenda, in both cases to portray him as an anti-Semite. For example, at one point, she says that Nietzsche believed that the Jews were morally, spiritually, and biologically diseased, and she says that Nietzsche believed that blonde Aryans are superior and the Jews are inferior. But here, I have a quote that directly refutes that interpretation. This is from Human All Too Human, number 475. Quote, "Incidentally, the whole problem of the Jews exists only within national states, inasmuch as their energy and higher intelligence, their capital of spirit and will, which accumulated from generation to generation in the long school of their suffering, must predominate to a degree that awakens envy and hatred. And so, in the literature of nearly all present-day nations, and in fact in proportion to their renewed nationalistic behavior, there is an increase in the literary misconduct that leads the Jews to the slaughterhouse as scapegoats for every possible public and private misfortune. As soon as it is no longer a matter of preserving nations, but rather of producing the strongest possible mixed European race, the Jew becomes as useful and desirable an ingredient as any other national quantity." End quote. Let's notice a few things. Nietzsche calls the writings of the anti-Semites literary misconduct and scapegoating. He even predicts that this kind of rhetoric will, quote, "lead the Jews to the slaughterhouse," end quote. Typically, this is not how people who hate the Jews talk about these issues. You don't usually call it scapegoating if you actually think the person is at fault for anything. And in fact, Nietzsche says the Jews are as desirable to Europe as any other race or nationality. In context, the passage is entitled "The European Man and the Destruction of Nations," and Nietzsche mentions this idea multiple times in his work. He thinks that it is inevitable that there shall be a, quote, "weakening and ultimately a destruction of nations," end quote. As a result, he hopes for continued crossbreeding between the various European ethnicities, a breaking down of these provincial nationalistic loyalties, and an embrace of pan-Europeanism. This project is part of what he calls being a good European, and he names the first true European in history as Friedrich II in Beyond Good and Evil 200. Why would Nietzsche say Friedrich II is the first true European? Weren't people living in Europe before that? Well, yes, but as Holy Roman Emperor, Friedrich sought to gather the best talents from the various nations he ruled to his court: Italians, Germans, French, and yes, Jews. As such, Nietzsche sees him as a forerunner to his vision for a new era in European civilization, an aristocracy of spirit which transcends national borders or ethnic loyalties. In so many words, Nietzsche believed in integrating the Jewish population into the broader European society, ceasing to view them with envy or hatred, which he says you would only do if you're consumed with all these nationalistic concerns, and instead regard them as a people of great intelligence and will, which was developed in the long school of suffering. You could say he's woke to the oppressive social conditions and power dynamics that the Jews lived under in Europe. But of course, you may have noticed something that Abigail would probably call very unwoke in Nietzsche's language at the end of the passage. He calls the Jews an ingredient. Nietzsche is thinking about nations and peoples as part of a grand project of race mixing, as he says, which sounds like eugenics, and that's because it is. Of course, this isn't something unique to Nietzsche. Many prominent intellectuals in his day believed in eugenics, but it would be disingenuous either to say that Nietzsche wasn't in favor of eugenics or to say that his view of eugenics bears any resemblance to either the theories of the Nazis or to modern-day racists. Why? Well, because he views mixing races as a good thing. It's like inclusive eugenics. I'm being somewhat tongue-in-cheek here, but I'm trying to highlight that Nietzsche's ideas would be anathema to the ideas of most racists, even as they would also be anathema to most modern progressive views on race. He doesn't fit into either one of those boxes. In the same passage in Beyond Good and Evil, where he names Friedrich the first true European, he says, he makes these claims about how a racially mixed populace will have both the advantages and the disadvantages of their parent peoples, and that this could be like a dangerous process. You multiply all the positive traits, but also the negative traits. The benefit of this, in Nietzsche's view, is that it ultimately results in types of people like Napoleon, or Caesar, or Friedrich II. These are some of Nietzsche's favorite people in all of history, made possible, in his view, by the intermingling of races and ethnicities. Now, it's easy enough for us to say that this is all pseudoscience, but, Nietzsche lived in the 19th century. We have the benefit of 150 years of scientific knowledge that he didn't have, and he followed the theories of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck had very different ideas about evolution from Darwin, but all of the science behind evolution was relatively new at the time. Accordingly, Nietzsche believed that different peoples could have different attributes according to the conditions they lived in, and that even certain talents could be passed on through genetics. And in the grand scheme of things, you could say with new discoveries in epigenetics, the notion of heritable talents isn't actually so far-fetched. What Lamarck really got wrong was the time scale on which these attributes could be developed and passed along. The problem is in presenting it as though Nietzsche thought certain races were superior to others, and particularly that the Germans were superior to the Jews. That claim is just to willfully lie, in my opinion. That's willfully lying about what he wrote. There's pretty much no one Nietzsche criticizes more viciously or more frequently than the Germans. Just for a few examples, quote, "Every great crime against culture for the last 4 centuries lies on Germany's conscience," end quote. Here's another one, quote, "Germany has deliberately made itself stupid for nearly a millennium. Nowhere have the 2 great European narcotics, alcohol and Christianity, been abused more dissolutely," end quote. Here's another one, quote, "Deutschland über alles. I fear that was the end of German philosophy. Are there any German philosophers? Are there German poets? Are there good German books? They ask me abroad. I blush," end quote. Once again, you can find many more quotes like this, but it's one of the most consistent positions in all of Nietzsche's work: hatred for the Germans. And when Nietzsche writes about Jews, it's consistently positive. Even when he includes a criticism, the overall assessment is usually along the lines of the passage we just considered from Human All Too Human. When he brings up the prejudice against Jews in his published work, he always holds that it's unfair and largely springs from the envy of the lowest common denominator type of people, the below-average people in every nation who hate whatever is exceptional. There's another passage in Daybreak, for example, section 205, that's worth looking at, because it shows how Nietzsche can make these arguments, which would certainly offend the sensibilities of somebody with modern progressive views on race, but if we read him sincerely and in context, we find that an anti-Semitic interpretation becomes impossible. Quote, "In Europe, the Jews have gone through a schooling of 18 centuries as no other nation has ever undergone, and the experiences of this dreadful time of probation have benefited not only the Jewish community, but even to a greater extent the individual. As a consequence of this, the resourcefulness of the modern Jews, both in mind and soul, is extraordinary. Amongst all the inhabitants of Europe, it is the Jews least of all who try to escape from any deep distress by recourse to drink or to suicide, as other less gifted people are prone to do. Every Jew can find in the history of his own family and of his ancestors a long record of instances of the greatest coolness and perseverance amid difficulties and dreadful situations, an artful cunning in fighting with misfortune and hazard, and above all, it is their bravery under the cloak of wretched submission, their heroic spernere se sperni, that surpasses the virtues of all the saints. People wish to make them contemptible by treating them contemptibly for nearly 20 centuries, and refusing them access to all honorable positions and dignities, and by pushing them further down into the meaner trades. And under this process they have not become any cleaner, but contemptible? They have never ceased for a moment from believing themselves qualified for the very highest functions, nor have the virtues of their suffering ever ceased to adorn them. Their manner of honoring their parents and children, the rationality of their marriages and marriage customs, distinguishes them amongst all Europeans. Besides this, they have been able to create for themselves a sense of power and eternal vengeance from the very trades that were left to them, or to which they were abandoned. Even in palliation of their usury, we cannot help saying that, without this occasional pleasant and useful torture inflicted on their scorners, they would have experienced difficulty in preserving their self-respect for so long. For our self-respect depends upon our ability to make reprisals in both good and evil things. Nevertheless, their revenge never urges them on too far, for they all have that liberty of mind, and even of soul, produced in men by frequent changes of place, climate, and customs of neighbors and oppressors. They possess by far the greatest experience in all human intercourse, and even in their passions they exercise the caution which this experience has developed in them." End quote. Again, notice the consistency between what he says in this passage and the one we looked at in Human All Too Human. Secondly, Nietzsche has overwhelming praise for the Jews here. In spite of all the contempt that's been thrown at them, they've not only remained an honorable people, whose courage in the face of adversity, quote, surpasses all the saints, end quote, but they haven't given in to despair or vindictiveness. Nietzsche does repeat the stereotype that the Jews are usurers, but he attributes that not to some fundamental flaw in the Jews, but rather blames the European society that forbid them from other trades. And he doesn't condemn them on this account. He says, we all have to make reprisals in order to feel self-respect. That's only human. And in the sections that follow, Nietzsche hopes that the Jewish people will continue to intermarry with noble Europeans, so that eventually they can helm the highest positions in society, maybe even become the leaders of Europe. Quote, "Then they will be called the pioneers and guides of the Europeans, whose modesty they will no longer offend." End quote. Now, there is a criticism that I've heard of Nietzsche that, quite contrary to the criticism made by PhilosophyTube, but nevertheless a criticism that some have said that Nietzsche at times almost seems to repeat the anti-Semitic stereotypes, in this case that the Jews may take over society in a couple hundred years, but with the twist that for Nietzsche, it's good actually, right? Personally, I think it's a little more complicated than that criticism makes it sound. Because the key thing for Nietzsche is that race is not a stable phenomenon. It's malleable. What defines a people can shift and change from generation to generation. The very fact that Nietzsche thinks that you could create a racial admixture that is positive, that sets him at odds with the Nazis and other racial essentialists who believed that all races were originally pure and distinct, and that all the problems came from interbreeding between them. But that kind of idea is never expressed by Nietzsche. He expresses the opposite, that human beings evolved from less complex animals. We don't come from ancestors that were genetically better. We don't need to retain some sort of purity the way we are. That's just stagnation. The entire idea of the Übermensch is the idea of creating sort of like a new race of humankind, that we are not good and perfect and pure the way that we are now. Nietzsche argues that all attempts to preserve a culture or preserve a nation state or a people are always undertaken to the detriment of the species mankind, because it's change, exceptions, breaking down boundaries that advances the species. Once you understand those basic elements of Nietzsche's philosophy, you understand that many of his remarks about race simply can't be interpreted the way that you would interpret them if they came from a racial essentialist or a modern-day racist. But the most important thing about that passage from Daybreak, number 205, is what the Nazis did with that same passage. This is how section 205 begins. Quote, "One of the spectacles which the next century will invite us to witness is the decision regarding the fate of the European Jews." End quote. You know what the Nazis did with this passage? I mean, I didn't even quote the whole thing, but you heard me reading the excerpts that I pulled out. I was reading for quite a while. It's a long passage. There's a lot there. You know what the Nazis did? In one of their anthologies, they simply took that first line about witnessing the fate of the European Jews, and they cut out the entire rest of the section. It's just that line. So if you read that line, independent of everything else Nietzsche says in the passage, you might assume that he's raising the so-called Jewish question in the way a Nazi would. I mean, if you just read that line, that Nietzsche says in the next century we will witness the fate of the European Jews, whatever it may be, you would never be able to glean that Nietzsche thinks the correct decision regarding the fate of the European Jews is that they should intermarry with the populace and take on positions of the greatest respect and importance, eventually become the best and brightest and the leaders of all Europe. I mean, if we go to the end of this passage, still in Daybreak 205, he writes that he hopes the Jewish people can find an outlet for, quote, "this abundant wealth of great impressions accumulated during such an extended period and representing Jewish history for every Jewish family, this wealth of passions, virtues, resolutions, resignations, struggles, and conquests of all kinds," end quote. And what will the outlet for this excess of Jewish energy be? Nietzsche predicts, quote, "great intellectual men and works," end quote. When this day comes, Nietzsche says that Jehovah will rejoice with his chosen people and all of us with him. Ask yourself again, are those the words of like an anti-Semite, or just to put it in the words of Philosophy Tube, of a man who hates the Jews and thinks they're inferior? These sentiments are not modern. They're not woke. You can call these sentiments assimilationist, you could call them eugenicist, but it's not based on hatred. It's quite the opposite. But by selectively editing his work the way that they did, the Nazis made it seem as if Nietzsche might have been on their side, as if he was posing the Jewish question the way that they might ask it. And you know who else did that? Abigail Thorn. The Nazis, in fact, opened one of their anthologies of Nietzsche's quotations with that line from Daybreak 205, and they knew what they were doing by cutting out the rest of it. And Abigail Thorn as well simply states, out of context, Nietzsche thought that the Jewish question was a real political issue. That's the exact same distortion that the Nazis made. And likewise, Abigail is an obscurantist about how Nietzsche actually answers the question later in the passage. She says he wavered a bit on what he thought the answer to that question was. But she doesn't present any of the quotations we've talked about here. She doesn't present the passage from Human All Too Human. She doesn't present this passage from Daybreak. She doesn't present that passage from Beyond Good and Evil. This is a wide swath of Nietzsche's career, so you can't just claim that I'm selectively quoting from one era of his work. Nietzsche is consistent on this. He always held that the Jewish people represented some of the best minds in Europe. He wished for them to be a key part of European society. The fact that he thought the question of the Jews was a relevant one probably has something to do with the fact that, as they mention in the Philosophy Tube video, there are literal parties that define themselves as being anti-Semitic. In other words, whether Nietzsche wanted it to be or not, it was a relevant political issue. So if Nietzsche's opposition to anti-Semitism was just like from a series of petty personal disputes, why does he reject the ideas of anti-Semitism in his actual published works? Why is Abigail Thorn doing the same thing the Nazis did and taking quotes out of context to make it appear that Nietzsche would have agreed with them? I don't know, but all I can say is that it has zero credence. It had zero credence then, and it has zero credence now. Her claims that Nietzsche hated the Jews, thought that they were inferior, or that they were diseased are all false. And even when Nietzsche makes remarks that are frankly awful about the Jews, such as further down in that same passage in Human All Too Human that we read from before, they're couched in a way that's meant to be conciliatory. And I'm going to read from that passage in the name of intellectual honesty, something PhilosophyTube did not display in this recent video on Nietzsche, but here we go. Quote, "Every nation, every man has disagreeable, even dangerous characteristics. It is cruel to demand that the Jew should be an exception. Those characteristics may even be especially dangerous and frightful in him, and perhaps the youthful Jew of the stock exchange is the most repugnant invention of the whole human race. Nevertheless, I would like to know how much one must excuse in the overall accounting of a people which, not without guilt on all our parts, has had the most sorrowful history of all peoples, and to whom we owe the noblest human being, Christ, the purest philosopher, Spinoza, the mightiest book, and the most effective moral code in the world. Furthermore, in the darkest medieval times, when the Asiatic cloud had settled heavily over Europe, it was the Jewish freethinkers, scholars, and doctors who, under the banner of the harshest personal pressure, held fast to the banner of enlightenment and intellectual independence and defended Europe against Asia. We owe to their efforts not least that a more natural, rational, and in any event, unmythical explanation of the world could finally triumph again, and that the ring of culture, which now links us to the Enlightenment of Greco-Roman antiquity, remained unbroken. If Christianity did everything possible to Orientalize the Occident, then Judaism helped substantially to Occidentalize it again and again, which, in a certain sense, is to say that it made Europe's history and task into a continuation of the Greek." End quote. Before we analyze this section, I hope it's painfully clear at this point that I'm by no means trying to exonerate Nietzsche of the charge of racial prejudice or unwokeness. Again, he lived in the 19th century. But I think passages like this reveal why the entire premise of PhilosophyTube's video is sort of farcical. Yes, it's racist to use Asiatic or Oriental as a metaphor for rigidity, traditionalism, and conformity, as Nietzsche does in the above passage. But we have to ask, seriously, did Nietzsche ever even meet an Asian person? I mean, it's one thing to promote false stereotypes about people that you live with and that you harbor hatred for or something. It's another to just repeat information or generalizations based on what you've read about places you've never been to and people you've never met. I'm not saying either one of those is okay, quote unquote, but the point of the argument I'm making here is that it's not about what's okay and what's not okay. That's a silly way to think about minds from history who don't think the way that we think. So I would suggest uncucking your brain. But you could zero in on any of those things, like the insensitive remark about the young Jew of the stock exchange. You could take that out of context and call Nietzsche a racist. Or you can actually try to figure out what he's saying in that passage. That remark reads to me like he's playing anti-Semite's advocate, right? In the way you play devil's advocate. The broader point is that whatever flaws an anti-Semite might bring up, no one can really hold the flaws of the Jews against them in light of their accomplishments, because after all, we all have our flaws. And look what they've been through, which he says, we all have guilt. We all played a part in the suffering that they've been through. And in the face of that suffering, the Jews have saved Europe time and again with their tradition of free thought. He's not talking about literal Asiatics or Orientalism or however he puts it. He's quite literally referring to Christianity and the dogmatism of the Middle Ages. He says, the Jews saved us from that. They're responsible for the Enlightenment, for intellectual independence. They're responsible for making European civilization a continuation of ancient Greece, which is probably the highest praise Nietzsche could give to almost anyone. He specifically shouts out Spinoza, whom Nietzsche called in one of his letters his precursor, philosophically. A bit odd for a man who hated the Jews to write excitedly, I have a precursor, and what a precursor, in reference to a Jewish philosopher. And Nietzsche also reminds us that the noblest human being, as he calls him, Jesus Christ, was also Jewish. And I could imagine somebody saying in response to that, but didn't Nietzsche hate Christianity? Well, yes, but I think this also goes to the heart of why the Philosophy Tube video was so bad, because it just misunderstands the way Nietzsche thinks. Sure, Nietzsche identifies with the master morality. He criticizes the slave morality, and the slave morality is associated with Christianity. But look at what he writes in Beyond Good and Evil 260. Quote, "There is master morality and slave morality. To this I immediately add that in all higher and mixed cultures, attempts at mediation between both moralities make an appearance as well, even more often a confusion and mutual misunderstanding between the two. In fact, sometimes their harsh juxtaposition, even in the same man, within a single soul." End quote. We in modern times are in one of those higher mixed cultures. As Nietzsche says elsewhere, such a juxtaposition of contrary moralities might create an immense tension within us. But he says in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil that such tensions of the soul, such drawing taut the bow of the soul, allows us to shoot for further possible goals. And in that same section, he says that we owe the grand style of architecture that gave us the pyramids in Egypt to what is essentially an error, astrology. If your conclusion from Nietzsche saying that is either that he thinks astrology is bad because errors are bad, or that we should go back to practicing astrology because it gave us the pyramids, then you've missed the point in either case, badly. Nietzsche opposed Christianity, but he doesn't treat it like we need to erase the history of Christianity. That's what made Europe what it is today. He thinks Christianity was an error, but it's part of who we are. And in fact, as a result of that error of Christianity and Christianity's power to make us self-conscious and to value things other than physical strength or value things other than hierarchy and biology, we've opened up new possibilities for humankind. Nietzsche spends so much time bashing Christianity because its values were unquestioned. By raising the contrast of the Greek or the Roman morality against the Christian, Nietzsche shows all that is harmful or dangerous about it, so that we can overcome it. We can move on to something better, yes, but not in the way that Abigail presents it as like hating it or like, society has all these problems and we have to find solutions, which is another very theoretical Platonist way of approaching Nietzsche. And that's just simply not right. Perhaps most importantly, for whatever he says about Christianity, he doesn't have any hatred for Jesus. He examines him as a psychological type. And he comes to some unflattering conclusions, but that's not the same thing as hatred. This is all way more complicated than the shallow analysis that Philosophy Tube provides us. It is true, as Abigail says, that Nietzsche attributes the genesis of Christianity to the Jews in Genealogy of Morals. Perhaps the best defense of this claim of Nietzsche's that I could muster would be that it's a historical fact. The interaction of the Roman Empire and the Jewish people is the social context that produces Jesus and Paul and the Christian religion. That's just indisputably true. Is this a reason to hate the Jews? Well, it should be clear from Nietzsche's writings that we've quoted that he doesn't come to that conclusion. Nietzsche puts it this way in Beyond Good and Evil, number 250, quote, "What does Europe owe to the Jews? Many things both good and bad, but mainly one thing that is both best and worst, the grand style and morality, the horror and majesty of infinite demands, infinite meanings, the whole romanticism and sublimity of the morally questionable, and consequently precisely the most appealing, insidious, and exceptional aspect of those plays of colors and seductions to life in whose afterglow the sky of our present European culture, its evening sky, glows away, perhaps goes away. This is why, among the spectators and philosophers, artists like us regard the Jews with gratitude." End quote. To me, that's fairly clear, right? It's more complicated than simple-minded praise or simple-minded hatred. But overall, he's grateful to the Jews because of what we mentioned earlier, that the religious set of values that they provided might have been an error from his perspective of his philosophy, but it's actually going to be a very productive error. The tension that's created within us is going to be a very productive error. And he says, perhaps in the afterglow, our present European culture, its evening sky glows away, perhaps goes away. What does this imply? I mean, to me, that says the present European culture that I want to overcome to move to this pan-European culture. And I should also say, I mean, for all the time that Abigail spends discussing Nietzsche's attempt to link Christianity with Judaism, she doesn't contextualize why he does this. Nietzsche made this emphasis of the Jewish origins of Christianity because the anti-Semites in Germany were attempting to recast Jesus as a Teutonic Aryan and to claim Christianity is an Aryan religion. In fact, Bernard Foster, Elizabeth Nietzsche's husband, wrote that Christ was in truth a brave Aryan fighter. He wasn't a Jew himself, but he was murdered by the Jews. Those were the kind of narratives that the anti-Semites were promoting. Now, of course, Abigail would have you believe that Nietzsche would have disagreed with that statement out of a mere petty personal dislike of Bernard Foster, and that the entirety of his writings on this subject, all of that was simply to get back at this man. No, really, Nietzsche wrote entire books, like The Genealogy of Morals and The Antichrist, solely because he didn't like Bernard Foster banging his sister. Does any of that make any sense to anyone? Now, I can imagine some of you are probably thinking, why are you spending more time than the entire length of the Philosophy Tube video mostly just addressing this one issue of the anti-Semitism issue in Nietzsche's work? And what I'll say is, for one, that's like a third to a half of the video. And secondly, it takes a long time to disentangle all of these oversimplifications and cherry picking and just simple-minded reductionism that people do towards Nietzsche's thought. It's very easy to throw out these oversimplified statements about Nietzsche. It's much harder, and it takes more time to go in with intellectual honesty, presenting things in context, reading these long excerpts, and trying to actually understand the complications of what Nietzsche is saying. So I'm not going to cover exhaustively every last inaccuracy in this video. I think that the problem is not any one of its blunders. The underlying problem that causes all of these blunders is a methodological problem. It's a problem with the approach. And hopefully by getting into the guts of the misrepresentations and showing why they're misrepresentations on this one issue, you can kind of have an insight into the general methodological problem of this entire video. And I think the stumbling block is that some of Nietzsche's ideas are so immoral from the standpoint of our modern beliefs, it just shuts off people's brains when they're trying to evaluate his ideas. So they start grouping his ideas together in pre-existing boxes or categories that they have for evil ideas like racism, but Nietzsche's ideas don't really belong in those boxes. So for example, Nietzsche never makes the claim that only Europeans can become philosophers. You're not going to find that line in his work. But Abigail comes to the conclusion that he would think that, in spite of the fact that Nietzsche doesn't make that claim directly, because a secondary source has sort of extrapolated that claim. And Abigail believed or trusted that secondary source, I guess because it fit with her priors or something like that, or I guess because it presented it in a way that fit the simplified narrative she was trying to present. But time and again, this pattern repeats. So for example, when Abigail suggests that Nietzsche is correlating the masters with blonde Aryans, well, he doesn't actually do that. The time when he refers to the warrior aristocracies of the master morality as blonde is when he uses the metaphor of the blonde beast. Does that refer to literal blonde Europeans? Well, that's at least debatable, isn't it? But in the very same passage, Nietzsche mentions, as an example of these warrior aristocracies who let the blonde beast leap out, he mentions Arabian and Japanese warrior aristocracies. Arabians and Japanese people are not blonde, they're not European. As for why Nietzsche invokes the blonde beast at all in that passage, Kaufmann argues it refers to a lion. You can take that explanation or leave it, but Nietzsche seems to present a United Nations of bloodthirsty psychopaths, if you will, in that passage. And that is how he characterizes it. You can say he's glorifying them, but he says they emerge from a, quote, orgy of bloodshed, end quote, to found nations and civilizations. And in context, it's clear that he's describing a phenomenon that's occurred many times in world history. It's by no means limited to Europeans. In fact, if you were to make that claim, it wouldn't even make sense with the underlying assertions made in the text. Abigail also brings up a passage that references Aryans in Twilight of Idols. Only Aryans in this context refers to Central Asians or South Asians, as in Indians, because Nietzsche's specifically talking about the Indian caste system. He's not talking about Aryans in the sense that people use it today, referring to blonde people. That gets a little confusing because it's unclear the extent to which Nietzsche thought that Europeans were descended from Aryans, but at the very least, the Aryans he's talking about in the passage are quite literally ancient Indians. This dovetails into another major problem. Abigail talks a fair amount about the Manu Law Book, a book detailing the rules of the Indian caste system, the French translation of which Nietzsche repeatedly referenced, and as Abigail points out, the claims made by this French translator, or the interpolations he made, have been called into question, scholarly question. But as Abigail puts it, Nietzsche's a big fan of this book. That's another kind of oversimplification. She doesn't mention that his engagement with the text is often critical. So what is Nietzsche's criticism? Well, that the law of Manu elevated the Brahmin, the priests, above the Kshatriyas, the warriors. He writes in a note found in Will to Power, numbered 142, quote, "Toward a critique of the law book of Manu, the whole book is founded on the holy lie. Was the well-being of mankind the inspiration of this system? Was this species of man who believes in the interestedness of every action, interested or not in imposing this system? To improve mankind. How is this intention inspired? Where is the concept of improvement derived from? We find a species of man, the priestly, which feels itself to be the norm, the high point, and the supreme expression of the type man. This species derives the concept improvement from itself. It believes in its own superiority. It wills itself to be superior, in fact. The origin of the holy lie is the will to power. Establishment of rule. To this end, the rule of those concepts that place a non plus ultra of power with the priesthood. Power through the lie, in the knowledge that one does not possess it physically, militarily. The lie as a supplement of power. A new concept of truth." End quote. So the law book of Manu, in spite of its hierarchical virtues from Nietzsche's point of view, is still an example of the priestly revolution in which the ascetics take power over the culture from the warrior class. And he says outright, the priests in India attained this power through deception, even though they didn't possess it militarily. It seems clear the priestly revaluation of values that he describes in the genealogy happens in India too, even under the Manu Law Book. This is precisely why it's so nonsensical when Abigail makes the claim that Nietzsche uses the word priest to refer to the Jews. If a priestly class ruled over India, that Nietzsche calls an Aryan society, what implications would that have for Abigail's reading of the situation? Well, Nietzsche tells us in the very next note, 143, quote, "A lot is said today about the Semitic spirit of the New Testament, but what is called Semitic is merely priestly. And in the racially purist Aryan law book, in Manu, this kind of Semitism, i.e. the spirit of the priest, is worse than anywhere else. The development of the Jewish priestly state is not original. They learned the pattern in Babylon. The pattern is Aryan." End quote. So it's a misreading to say he's equating the terms Jewish and priestly. The correct reading is that even though the priestly value system is called Semitic, there isn't anything essentially Jewish about it. Actually, he says explicitly of these holy lies that found priestly social orders, this is in back in Will to Power 142, quote, "That lie has been copied almost everywhere. Aryan influence has corrupted all the world." End quote. So Abigail says when Nietzsche says priest, he means Jews. But here when he says priests, he means Aryans. And he actually says the Jews got their priestliness from the Aryans. Rather than arguing that the Jews are corrupting the world, he says the Aryans have corrupted the world. It's completely the opposite of the way Philosophy 2 presents it. Nietzsche says something more subversive in the Antichrist. He writes in the concluding section, which is often omitted from the main text, he writes, quote, "The priest is our Chandala. He should be ostracized, starved, driven into every type of desert." End quote. Chandala means untouchable, and it's the term for the lowest caste in the Hindu caste system. At another point in the video, Abigail suggests that the term itself is bullshit, but that isn't true. Not only is this a historically attested fact, but the Indian caste system was practiced even in recent history. Abigail says that Chandala is another code word for the Jews, but this section is called a law against Christianity, and here Nietzsche is not referring to the historical Chandala nor to Jewish people. It's not even clear that he's referring to Christian priests. He's saying in our new valuation of values as free spirits, the priests, who are the people who want to sell you a metaphysics or a morality, who could even be a philosopher or an academic, will see them as philosophically unclean, which is the inversion of the Manu Law book. So practice good philosophical hygiene, stay away from such ideas. That's often how Nietzsche uses the term Chandala as a metaphor. But philosophy too would have you believe it's just code word for the Jews. And again, the key is context, which is something totally lacking in their video. Another place where Nietzsche discusses the Manu Law book is in a section of Twilight of Idols called The Improvers of Mankind. And Abigail directly claims that he calls the Jews the Chandala here. But again, if we look at the whole passage, it's obvious he's not making a racial claim that the Jews descended from the Indian Chandala. Philosophy Tube, I think, is incapable of distinguishing when Nietzsche is speaking metaphorically or when he's referring to the historical caste in India. In this passage, Nietzsche contrasts two ways of attempting to improve mankind. One is by Christianity, another is by the Manu Law book. He draws that contrast again to show us something about both of these systems or value sets. So the Christian method of improvement is by morality, which he also calls taming. He describes the negative effects of this improvement by taming, because it gives a bad conscience to the strong and the healthy. He then goes on to say that, in comparison to this, the New Testament looks wretched next to the Manu Law book, because the Manu Law book codifies the pathos of distance, the order of rank, and so on. The Book of Manu is essentially an attempt to biologically improve mankind via eugenics. That's how he interprets it. This is the method of improvement by breeding. And so Nietzsche eventually argues neither of these methods of improving mankind are harmless. They both cause suffering. They both inflict a kind of torment or tyranny over their subjects. He writes in the concluding section, quote, "The morality of breeding and the morality of taming, and the means in which they adopt in order to prevail, are quite worthy of each other. We may lay down as a leading principle that in order to create morality, a man must have the absolute will to immorality. This is the great and strange problem with which I have been so long occupied, the psychology of the, quote, improvers of mankind. A small and at bottom perfectly insignificant fact known as the Pia Fraus first gave me access to this problem. The Pia Fraus, the heirloom of all philosophers and priests who, quote, improve mankind. Neither Manu, nor Plato, nor Confucius, nor the teachers of Judaism and Christianity have ever doubted their right to falsehood. They have never doubted their right to quite a number of other things. To express oneself in a formula, one might say, all means which have been used heretofore with the object of making man moral were through and through immoral," end quote. And so I think this is a perfect example of why the philosophy tube reading is so disingenuous. In this concluding section, he compares the morality of breeding to the morality of taming, and it becomes clear it's in a way it's a criticism of both, because he says they're worthy of each other in the means which they use to attain their ends, right? So he's saying what the morality, the Christian morality does, and what the law book of Manu does are morally equivalent, or we might say immorally equivalent. This passage shows us that the regime of morality, which is a regime of resentment and bad conscience and pity, is exactly as cruel as the caste system that creates the untouchables. You could argue that that's the real point of the passage, or the real insight here. And notice that Nietzsche always puts the words improve and improvers in scare quotes and says that their task is based on a holy lie. That is the meaning of the term Pia Fraus. A holy lie is the thing that unites all those who improve mankind, who seek to reach a moral end by immoral means. And he includes Manu with the teachers of Judaism and Christianity. They're equivalent to each other among those who have deceived themselves and the rest of mankind in order to reshape human beings. by that contrast with the Manu Law book, we can see the dangers of Christianity, the dangers of the moral method of improving man. That said, again, it's certainly debatable. We could argue about the interpretations. We could argue about the implications of a passage like this. And we could argue how other people in future contexts might take what Nietzsche is saying. But he tells us straight out what his focus is, at least. He says, quote, the psychology of the, quote, improvers of mankind, end quote. That's what his focus is. He's interested in the mind of the person who, like Plato or Manu or Jesus and Paul, dares to act immorally, to impose a tyranny, biological or moral or otherwise, for ends that they consider to be good. And the terrible truth of the matter is that whatever our modern judgments are about these regimes of taming or regimes of breeding, we are a product of them. Both value systems have had an effect on the history of civilization, both the universalist, otherworldly, priestly values of Christianity and the values of privilege and ethnic allegiance. He says both are ultimately falsifications of the world, an arbitrary I will that rigidified and became worshipped as a thou shalt. In their way, both methods are repugnant, but they're also both a part of us. Another shallow attempt at analysis in the video occurs when some of the only quotes from the primary sources are read, and she concludes reading from a section of The Gay Science in which Nietzsche says that, quote, even the boldest insanities of metaphysics can be seen as the symptoms of certain bodies, end quote. Arguing that this passage, necessarily means that Nietzsche thought that only white Europeans could be philosophers, again, something he never said. I couldn't help but think of another passage from The Gay Science that completely undermines the notion that Nietzsche thinks there's only one type of body that's necessarily superior, or that what constitutes health or strength in an individual or in a group of people is necessarily uniform. Well, Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, number 120, quote, there is no such thing as health in itself, and all attempts to define a thing in that way have lamentably failed. It is necessary to know your aim, your horizon, your powers, your impulses, your errors, and especially the ideals and fantasies of your soul in order to determine what health implies, even for your body. There are consequently innumerable kinds of physical health. And the more one again permits the unique and unparalleled to raise its head, the more one unlearns the dogma of the equality of men, so much the more also must the conception of a normal health, together with a normal diet and a normal course of disease, be abrogated by our physicians. And then only would it be time to turn our thoughts to the health and disease of the soul, and make the special virtue of everyone consist in its health. But to be sure, what appeared as health in one person might appear as the contrary of health in another. End quote. Now again, what could you zero in on if you want to say Nietzsche's not woke? You could focus in on the fact that we have to unlearn the dogma of the equality of men. And that's true. Nietzsche doesn't believe in the equality of men. But there's an element of this that's just, getting triggered by wrongthink and trying to put Nietzsche's thought in a box where it doesn't belong again. Because Nietzsche's critique of the doctrine of the equality of men is, it's part of that metaphysical and moral tendency to equate unequal things. So it's also a critique of, when the Nazis suggest that every member of the German race is equally superior in their value to every member of the Jewish race. They're making such an equation of the unequal. And what kind of people make those equations? Typically the ones who have nothing else to take pride in except for the accomplishments of other people that they happen to share an ethnicity with or something. What Nietzsche says we should permit in this passage is the unique and unparalleled. In other words, difference, individuality, peculiarity, not merging the individual into a mass culture. It's easy for Abigail to focus in on Nietzsche saying philosophy is a symptom of bodies and assume that he has a particular kind of body in mind as the image of the kind of body that should philosophize. But here it's clear that he believes in innumerable types of bodies, innumerable kinds of healths or kinds of strength, and thus, by implication, innumerable kinds of ideals, fantasies, impulses, powers, even errors that could produce health. Do these seem like the words of someone who's committed to a single race or a single type of person as the only kind of person who has value? Because to me, that kind of idea seems antithetical to this passage. And that's the real methodological failure here, or like the deepest methodological failure. This left-wing person said this about Nietzsche. That right-wing person said that about Nietzsche. This idea in Nietzsche is good and woke. That idea in Nietzsche is bad and unwoke. How about instead, how about trying to constellate all of the ideas in Nietzsche and understand them relative to one another, understand why he puts them forward, how his ideas work in conjunction. And if you do this, you realize that racist ideology is impossible if you accept the anti-essentialist stance of Nietzsche, at least in the sense like that the Nazis believed or a racial essentialist believes in. Because when he talks about the characteristics of entire races or civilizations, he doesn't think they're essential characteristics. There can't be such a thing as a superior race in the final analysis, because the word race is a provisional designation. It's another equation of unequal things. It's another Platonic category. It's an invention of language. Or if you understand that Nietzsche isn't trying to undo all the errors of the past, that the vibe of Nietzsche, to put it crudely, isn't this lamentation over everything's gone off the rails and we have to fix it. If you understand that, you wouldn't think that his criticism of Christianity constitutes a hatred that somehow spills over into like a racial animus toward the Jews for having created it. That just simply isn't how Nietzsche thinks. That's how like a simple-minded anti-Semite would think. And so Abigail's reading of Nietzsche is often just as bad as like the stereotypical narcissistic teenager's reading of Nietzsche, just seen from the other side, right? They say, here's Nietzsche who says all these evil things, and I like that. She says, here's Nietzsche who says all these evil things, and I don't like that, right? But there's no attempt at any point to understand how does one idea relate to the others or inform the others. Instead, you're just doing this cherry picking and moralistic designation of certain ideas as good or bad, left-wing, right-wing, woke, not woke. And I know she tries to like kind of transcend this framing at the end, but that's the methodology that the whole video is based on. And so, you know, once again, I'm well aware Abigail Thorn says, I'm not here to cancel Nietzsche. The whole Philosophy Tube video was Nietzsche Woke can be seen as a kind of like practical joke. So I suppose we're in agreement that it isn't a meaningful question to ask whether Nietzsche is woke or not. But I return to the question I posed at the beginning of the video in that case. Like, what is the point of Philosophy Tube? Does Abigail Thorn's video actually get us to move beyond woke and unwoke? Think about Nietzsche on a deeper level? I would argue no. In the end, the content of the video amounts to little more than a smear job. It ignores the historical context of Nietzsche's thought. It ignores the places in his work where he directly contradicts the claims in the video. And it promotes strained, bizarre readings of his works, in which priest is code for Jew, and opposition to anti-Semitism is nothing more than evidence of these just petty personal disputes. And so we're left with the claim that it's foolish to say whether or not Nietzsche is woke, but it's obvious to say he was an anti-Semitic racist. The video ridicules the idea of asking whether Nietzsche is woke or not, because after all, such framings are usually superficial and agenda-driven, but the analysis that Abigail presents is superficial and agenda-driven. What was the point of it all? Was it all solely for clicks? Is that the entire point of Philosophy Tube? And if so, then why am I doing this? Because you all asked me to? Is it all for more clicks? Am I becoming one of those channels that just complains about what other people do because all of you want someone to validate your complaints? Am I just as much part of this problem? Am I contributing to the brain rot? Meaningless discussions over the morality of people who are long dead because people in the modern day have attached their identity to these long dead people. Is there no way out of this vortex, this time suck, this drain on our mental energy, to no point in purpose? Do I give power to this vortex, even by spending time criticizing it? What are we going to do about this? I have no idea. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Signing off.